Hey everyone, so it's finally time to talk about Reservation Dogs Season 2. And of course, if you haven't seen Season 1 already or know anything about the show, it's the brain love child of particularly Sterling Harjo and Taika Waititi. And it's streaming on Hulu right now. So before I get into my take on this second season, I need to address my take on the first season.
It's just a baby.
So when I had watched the first season, I was kind of used to watching shows that kind of had a continuous plot, or like we focus on like one particular character and then like we watch them go throughout, or like even if it's multiple characters like Game of Thrones or like even The Walking Dead. I was kind of used to that style of show, and so I think that affected my take on the first season. I hadn't been exposed yet to this idea of surrealism in media. The biggest example of this is actually the show Atlanta, where Afro-Surrealism is portrayed. Afro-Surrealism is a whole nother topic on its own, and there's even a manifesto associated with it by D.Scot Miller. I'll put the manifesto and the article about it in the description box. And YouTuber Thomas Flight even has a great video essay about the topic on his analysis of Atlanta. If I'm understanding the movement and genre correctly, it seeks to explore the Black experience in a quote-unquote post-race society by using devices like absurdism, mysticism, and irreverence, just to name a few. And they are used for emotional impact and to revitalize and explore Blackness. It also works to subvert and even alienate white audiences and calls into question the reality of marginalized groups. And since watching an episode or two, I understood Reservation Dogs a lot better. It's my opinion that Reservation Dogs is an Indigenous response and witness to Atlanta and the Afro-Surrealist movement.
Oh, young warrior, crazy hair.
Kind of having its own Indigenous surrealism. Now, D.Scot Miller mentions that any marginalized group in a colonial society can tap into it, and that's what I think Sterling Harjo and Taika Waititi are doing here. Taika Waititi has explored his own version of Indigenous surrealism in films like Boy, and even used a similar style in Jojo Rabbit. And of course, Sterling Harjo does it a lot as well in his short films, and obviously goes deeper into it in this show. And of course, I'll get back to the use of the word surrealism here in a bit. But, like I was saying, I wasn't used to that type of storytelling and media when I watched the first season. And even though I had that better understanding, my verdict is that this second season is definitely better than the first. And I'd argue with any show, any other season is sometimes better than the first. But this one definitely kind of leaned into a lot more. It wasn't afraid to talk about certain things. And that kind of just leads me into my thoughts about this season. So this cast and characters of this season and their journeys are pretty much the same from the first one, with a few that we get to dig a little bit deeper into. But we mainly focus on our four kids: Alora, Bear, Cheese, and Willie Jack. But we got to see a little bit more about Big in this season, as well as Rita, Bear's mom. And so last season I complained that we didn't get to see too much of Cheese and, kind of know him more as a character, but this season we got it in episode 7. And we have an interesting cameo by comedian Mark Maron, and he plays like the boys' home leader guy, and it's just his humor just bleeds out very well, and how he has the banter with all these boys and everything. It was just a pretty funny cameo.
Once again, everyone has failed to engage with the step. Except for Chester, a little bit, doesn't matter. I'm just happy you're all walking this path with me, and okay, let's call it.
But what I really liked about this episode was that we got to have a bit of a deeper dive into Cheese and just kind of what kind of kid he really is. And, you know, he's very idealistic. In my season 1 review, I said that he's a bit of like a young native Samuel Tarly. And that's testified even more so in this season, especially with this episode. He's really intuitive, and he kind of calls out a lot of the BS and strangeness in his world. He either acknowledges it, like internally you see him like, what the hell?
I was arrested for no reason. I was sent to a poorly funded group home. There's that.
We have a sweet moment where he's in the bunk bed and he's looking at the notebook of all his friends writing in it, and then like I think he texts or calls the grandma that he kind of adopted in the first season, and it just showed that he still cares. He's a good kid, you know. And plus I just love the shirts he had on throughout that episode and throughout the season. I identified very personally with a lot of those shirts. But like I just enjoyed the ending because it's shown at the beginning that his uncle, played by Nathan Apodaca, I'll get back to him in a bit, is arrested, and so he has no real family, like any legal guardianship. But what I just appreciated was like the grandmother that he kind of hung out with and adopted for his own in the first season. She legitimately is like given legal guardianship over him. I know, that was just sweet. It was nice. I enjoyed it. And ultimately Cheese is a good kid. I really enjoyed that episode. It was a nice little episode. And I also enjoyed how the characters around Cheese, they kind of change, you know, because of how he is. He kind of pushes these people to look inwards a bit without really being really pushy about it, if that makes sense. He just asks them questions or listens to them, and they change. It's very interesting. I really enjoyed that about Cheese. And with Bear, now we got to see a little bit more with Bear this time around into his journey of manhood by getting a construction job. And again, we see Nathan Apodaca working in the crew, but with this time around, we actually get to see Daniel's dad, Danny, played by Michael Spears. And I just enjoyed that. I'll get more into that episode here in a bit, but I just like that episode because we just got to see, because I complained last season that, you know, Bear was a little dense and everything, but with this time we actually get to see him go through stuff. He gets hazed a little by these other guys, you know, typical things that happen with young men who enter the workforce. And seeing more of William Knifeman there too, I thought was great. But yeah, I just thought seeing Bear's journey in that episode was actually very interesting. And Alora's journey throughout the season, in my opinion, had the most change, because the season begins with her misadventures with Jackie as they're trying to make their way to California. Their car breaks down, they get picked up by this really weird guy, they escape, they get taken in by that sweet old lady, but then they steal her truck, you know, all that stuff. So like she seems lost, right? But when we get to the Grandma Mabel episode, and even the ending of this season as a whole, she had a lot of growth. And I'll talk more a bit about the Mabel episode here in a bit as well. But that, I just thought it was interesting how we got to see that she kind of had a change of motivations and a change of priorities. And finally with Willie Jack, obviously with her strongest, probably the most strongest episode, which is episode 9, but she also had a bit of a change or an arc to her where she also, like Alora, kind of had a bit of a deeper understanding of maybe where her life can be going. And again, I'll talk about that episode here in a bit too, but I just enjoyed that. I like seeing these kids change. And Decolonativization, I think that's how you say it, that episode with the young elders coming in and giving a seminar to these young kids. That episode was actually pretty good. You know, I think a lot of people can relate to being in a situation like that, whether you're a native or not.
We've got some great sessions planned today.
Also, you gotta stay to the end to get your gift card. Thank you so much.
But that episode was just full of just really good rich comedic moments. I love the elder going up on stage and having them address all sacred directions, but they don't know which way is north and east and west. And of course, obviously, Amber Midthunder and Elisha Pratt as the young elders, like they were the best part of that whole episode. I love Amber Midthunder did a great job. I actually kind of want to see her do more comedy now, because her character was just so again, like their characters, I don't want to say that they're like people in real life all the time. I think they're more of an archetype that a lot of modern native people have, where you're just kind of really wanting to be traditional, you know, and putting off this vibe that you hold sacred wisdom even though you're like still figuring your life out. You know, just those bits. The whole land acknowledgement bit was probably the funniest part for me.
But before we get started today, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional caretakers of this land, the Caddo, the Osage, and the Muskogee, of course. But before them were our Neanderthal relatives, so acknowledge them. And before that, even the dinosaur nation, Dinosaur Oyate, you know. Before that, the Star People, also our reptilian relatives above and below Earth. Yeah. So.
And then there's a scene where she's like blessing herself with fog machines. And it's just stuff like that. And then she's like, yeah, I actually grew up in Orange County, you know, stuff like that. The episode was pretty good. I know there's some background stuff with Willie, Jack, and Jackie, but I just didn't. It was a slightly overshadowed with the rest of it, but like still, I enjoyed that episode. It was a fun episode. We also got a really good episode dedicated to Rita and her anti-gang going to an IHS conference. Yeah, the whole episode was a fun one. You know, like it didn't take itself too seriously. There was some moments where Rita is speaking with her, I believe it's her sister, and they have some serious moments and all that, but like I can't say too much about that episode because I am not like a native woman. So like, but it was just fun seeing them have fun, you know, and it was fun seeing them just kind of bond together, looking deeper into the modern experience of an Indigenous woman, I guess. I can't say that 100% sure because I'm not an Indigenous woman, right? But I just love their dance routine that they did, their dance routine. That was pretty killer. And then Tatanka Means coming in for a cameo was, I thought, for that episode in particular, I thought was actually pretty good. He did a really good job. And you know, I think the sense I got of that episode for me personally was kind of like this sense of like Indigenous sisterhood that I don't want to say is lost, but it's just like we don't see that much in media. And then finally we got to see a little bit more about Big. I'll get that to here in a bit. This season wasn't afraid to go all out on the feels. We got to see just way more raw moments from our characters this time around. And it's to say we didn't have any more in the last season, right? But I feel like this season, those raw emotions and moments from our characters were a little bit deeper. And of course, Big's episode was by far the most out there. But also deep in the sense that like we got to see just another side of Big that we didn't get to see before. This episode, of course, opens with him accidentally taking some acid or DMT, and he is just tripping in the forest. But because of that, it kind of forces him to dig a little bit deeper into some memories he has and how he feels guilty about Alora's mom, Cookie, her death. It's suggested that he could have stopped it from happening, but like it was just a simple mistake or like just a quick poor lack of judgment on his part, but like it was a mistake, right? But he beats himself up for it and it's pretty obvious. And I don't know, it was interesting because, you know, Big's character, even in the last season with his interaction with the deer lady, he takes that type of stuff seriously, mysticism and spirituality. But you know, I thought it was more about Big, the episode, and of course the whole catfish thing with the evil white man cult, like that whole that whole thing was just it was hilarious. I enjoyed that. I actually enjoyed Kenny Boy. We got to see like Kenny Boy, he comes in kind of helping Big out a little. They get caught and everything, but the deer lady comes back, played by kind of Theo Horn, and I really enjoyed their interactions. It's actually kind of cool how it's suggested that like Kenny Boy is familiar with the deer lady and she knows him, you know, and I thought that was cool. That was a cool little snippet of like world building right there. I just enjoyed how the dear lady comes to just remind Big that, like, listen, as long as you're trying to be good, you're okay, right? It's enough, right? I don't know. I liked that. I just thought it was for Big's character, and that kind of had me look a little bit deeper into like the other things that happen in this show. So finally, with episode 4 around Alora's grandma Mabel. So this episode in particular was very interesting. It almost, obviously, you know, I was bawling by the end of it. For Alora, for her character, there's a scene where she's grabbing a chair, very similar to like this one here, from another room and bringing it into the living room. And of course, like, a lot of people are at this house. Aunts, cousins, friends, all these people, like kids opening the door and running in and out. We get like this long tracking shot and like following her with it, right? That whole episode, it took place in one location, but it managed to keep the momentum going and keep the whole thing interesting. But like, just the entire time, it was just familiar. You know, I have been in funerals where it was kind of like that, and it's like, it's not all sad. It's just people are gathered, talking and cooking and laughing and making jokes here and there and stuff like that. It just felt very familiar to me. I always like to think about The Godfather, because The Godfather, directed by and written by 2 Italian Americans, and there's moments in that film where it just, you can tell there's some authenticity behind it. So much so that in the first Godfather, there's a full-blown sauce recipe given to us. Francis Ford Coppola, like, he really fought to have certain moments feel as authentic as it could in the film, because he's Italian. He knows what that feels like.
It's not just about the cooking. This is the scene where Clemenza is talking to Michael, and he tells them that the families have to go to war every 10 years or so, and while he's telling them that, they're just happening to make him tomato sauce, and that's why the scene is so important.
I love this scene. You never seen anything like it in a gangster film.
It's essential. You have to see them making the tomato sauce. It humanizes them.
And this episode really harkened that for me. I mean, the whole show does, but like this episode in particular, it was so familiar to me, and I really enjoyed it. And then finally, with Mabel's death, that was handled with so much reverence and nuance. Obviously, like, you know, with the elders singing the Muskogee hymns in the background, and Alora just kind of seeing that, and then her reaction afterwards, all of it. I mean, of course it was sad, but it just had this tinge of the spiritual reverence and almost ceremonial reverence behind it. Gave it a sense of that, like, you know, they're sending her on her journey. I mean, William Knifeman even says so to Bear. He's like, yeah, I'm getting ready to take her to orientation. Devery Jacobs did an amazing job with writing that episode and also just acting and performing in it. And of course, you know, we're crying with her after her grandma Mabel dies, and then just seeing her at the end, it hit me personally, because, you know, I've lost grandparents, and but even after she's gone, you know, she's still her chippery self. It just it was comforting. I loved it. I loved that episode. Oh yeah, and like Cheese being asked to say the prayer was too relatable for me. I've been in that exact situation before, where either at a funeral or like another family gathering or a wedding, sometimes it's like, you know, my relatives have asked me to like be the one to give the prayer, and I just thought it was funny. I was like, I know that feeling. And then Cheese's prayer itself was just hilarious. And the roofing episode, again, going back to that one, the reason why I thought it was interesting was because we got to, character-wise too, we got to get a little bit deeper into Daniel's father, Danny. But Danny and Bear kind of had like these deeper moments together, talking about how Daniel's death has affected both of them. But Danny gives Bear some really solid advice about life. How Danny is just encouraging Bear. And I think it's like, it's a real life male mentor that I think Bear has needed for the longest time. And I really enjoyed that. But in the end, towards the end of the episode, they have pretty much a spiritual experience where, you know, this beam of light is just kind of floating above them. And of course, from one angle, it kind of looks like it's just light refracting, but then we get like this side angle profile, and it's like right there. So it's not like not happening. It's there. It's looking at them. It's and obviously you could assume that it's Daniel's spirit. What I really appreciated about that moment though was how Danny reacted to it. Danny was a little taken back by it at first, but then Bear said something and Danny kind of shushes him. That for me was a very interesting reaction because it suggests to me that Danny was taking this experience in as a very sacred and spiritual experience. It was real to him. It was sacred. Don't ruin this moment. And I enjoyed that about that episode. And then finally, Willie Jack's episode, Offerings. Probably the strongest episode next to I don't know, they're all strong, but this episode in particular I thought was interesting because one, we get to see Daniel's mother, who is actually in prison, and of course we don't need to know why and everything. Her name is Hokti, and she's played by Lily Gladstone. But what's interesting is we actually get to see a kind of female counterpart to William Knifeman. She doesn't really have a name per se. She's played by Tap Sampson, and like William Knifeman, she's a little, you know, irreverent and blunt about certain things, and I just thought her character really quickly too was just very effective for this episode. Willie Jack is obviously feeling a little, you know, jumbled and about her friendship with her little group of friends, and she goes to her for kind of advice. And what I thought was interesting though, it's suggested by both Hotke's spirit, her ancestor spirit guide person, that she is a descendant of healers. Hotke says that later to Willie Jack as well, and so she definitely has certain spiritual gifts, and which it's interesting because maybe Bear does too, who knows. It's this episode in particular that I think for me, it really captures a lot of what I think a lot of people whose ancestors have suffered under colonial oppression are looking for. Willie Jack is a little, you know, she goes to her and she tells her to say a prayer, or she's gonna lead her in prayer. Obviously she's kind of feeding her some wisdom about where she comes from. And of course we have that scene where Willie Jack is praying, and then from Hotke's perspective we see her spirit ancestor and all her other ancestors behind Willie Jack. And in just that image alone already, it hit me, and I think it hit a lot of people. We hear someone singing in the background, and they're all just kind of looking on at Willie Jack, and Hockey is telling her that, you know, remember where you come from, you know, no matter where you go, your ancestors are there for you. And that whole, I was in tears. I was beside myself in an overwhelming way, not like a bad way. There's a moment where she puts her hand on Willie Jack's shoulder, and Willie Jack can feel it, and she's like,
Oh shit.
and I think that's, I'm sorry, but like that's a moment that a lot of people crave, that feeling to know that our ancestors are there. And Hockey tells Willie Jack, you know, like, your ancestors are there for you, they're rooting for you. And I felt that even now, just talking about it and thinking about it, it just gets to me, you know. It's what drives us to survive. The episode was good medicine. It strengthened a lot of people, in my opinion. I like to watch Cinema Therapy. One of the guys on there talks about how filmmaking is one of the higher art forms out there, and I think this type of scene, this scene in particular, really encapsulated that for me. It just captured a moment that, like, it's really hard to get that, like, in I mean, of course you can get it in literature, you know, you can get it in in other visual arts, but like just seeing it played out that way in like a prison of all places, it just hit very hard for me, very personally. I've always wanted to have a moment like that shown on screen for a character. I looked at Star Wars Rise of Skywalker when Rey is like laying on the ground and she's looking at the stars, and then she hears all the voices of the Jedi of the past, and they all tell her that like we're all here. I guess for me, when I watched that scene, I was like, I would love to see a scene like that for an Indigenous character in a more meaningful way, not a cheesy way where, you know, the spirits of her ancestors guide her to fight or whatever, but like it was if the way they handled it in this episode of Reservation Dogs was exactly what I think a lot of people needed to see and hear. And then for me personally, like it just kind of solidified even stronger what it is I like doing and what I want to do, you know, is to talk more and push forward Native representation in this field. No matter what we do, whether we're in STEM or in the arts or in our parenting, you know, it just kind of helped me realize that, like, you know, yeah, no, your ancestors are there. They're there to help you and guide you and protect you. It just reminded me that, like, for a lot of people, you know, we need to remember our ancestors' struggles, but also be their hope, be their wildest dreams, you know. And what's fascinating about this episode is that, for again, like Daniel and Bear's experience, like for Alora's experience seeing her grandma after she died, for Hookie and Willie Jack, this moment was real. It wasn't some sort of metaphorical thing that we saw in their head. It was a very real experience for them, which immediately leads me to the last episode, the ending of the season. The kids go to California, car gets stolen. They're kind of just stuck there. They're hanging out with homeless folk. They go to the beach and they kind of all have their moments about reflecting on Daniel. And then they go into the ocean and they all kind of gather and they huddle together. And then they see Daniel. And Daniel sees them. They acknowledge him. It's clever editing too, where there's a couple angles that show him just kind of randomly there. They're huddled together and then they cut back out and then he's gone, right? I think that was just, it solidified for me the whole gist of the season about believing, right? And the episode is literally called I Still Believe. It ends with homie from Lost Boys singing I still believe, and then the homeless Jesus quoting scripture about blessed are those who believe and not see, right? And I think that perfectly encapsulated pretty much the whole season. This leads me into, I guess, my idea of Indigenous surrealism. Now, so the word surrealism implies that whatever you're seeing, is it real? But it seems real. I think with using the term Indigenous surrealism, it's more of, I would say you could use it more as an academic term, but in my opinion, it's more about capturing the indigenous spiritual reality. I think that encapsulates it a little bit better. The manifesto of Afro-Surrealism talks about kind of manifesting the unseen, both like things of the past and otherworldly, right? Again, I don't want to take away from D.Scot Miller's manifesto, but it doesn't quite address the direct influence of spirituality. It talks about mysticism, but not spirituality. But so I would say that Indigenous surrealism taps into the indigenous spiritual reality. Because like I said, all of these experiences for our characters, it was real. Danny and Bear did see a light. Hotki is seeing one of her ancestors, and Willie Jack felt that ancestor touch her. Alora saw her grandma after she died. You know, like these were experiences that for a lot of indigenous people now, it's a reality for them. And I actually kind of talked a bit about this in my Natives in Horror video, the second one. I talked about how it's a little difficult to kind of capture certain indigenous horror stories or cryptids from a non-native perspective, because a lot of these cryptids, creatures, or spirits, they're very real for a lot of native people today. Like that's why if you talk about skinwalkers in front of some native people, Navajos in particular, they'll get a little like because for them it's real, and for these characters, these experiences were real and they were very sacred. And this show managed to capture it in a way that was just, it seemed very special and it wasn't corny. I think maybe to a non-native person watching it, it may come across corny, but that's just because that's not their reality. It boils down to that. So it's not that I'm like negating Afro-Surrealism, but I guess I'm adding on to it. The idea of surrealism in media, where Indigenous surrealism can have all the same aspects of Afro-Surrealism. I guess what I'm adding on to is that Indigenous surrealism also entails the very spiritual reality of the Indigenous characters, because in real life, that's what it is. It's spiritual experiences are very real to a lot of Native people. That's all I pretty much have to say about this season. I didn't want to do what I did last time and go by episode. I felt like just kind of talking about it generally would kind of give a better feel for like what I was feeling. And I can't wait to see what they do with season 3. This season kind of ended with maybe the anticipation that it might not be renewed for a 3rd season. So we'll see what happens, because at Rutherford Falls got canceled. But the ending I loved seeing the map in the end credits of the 2nd season. That was a good map. I enjoyed it. But overall, like this season, I'm giving it like a full 10 out of 10 A+. Like every single episode had its place. It makes me, the 3rd season makes me excited. Everything else here afterward makes me excited, because again, I mentioned this in I think in one of my Prey reviews, but like we're going through a new wave of Indigenous filmmaking and Indigenous themed filmmaking. I don't want to say a renaissance, because like Jenna Schmieding mentioned, it suggests that like it was dead and is like being brought back to life. It never was gone. The Indigenous filmmaking now is having this resurgence and a new wave of kind of being more robust. And I think there are more and more Indigenous filmmakers and content makers and artists who are just being more bold about putting themselves out there. I think a lot of other, non-native producers and studios, I think they're kind of taking a chance with these filmmakers or these stories, and that just makes me excited. I have a few announcements coming down the road for you guys, but in the meantime, I want to talk other random little nitty stuff. I'll talk to you guys later. I'll try to be more active on social media as well, and so I'll see you guys in the next one.